Welcome to Focus on Abilities, a program about issues affecting the lives of people with disabilities. My name is Lex Frieden. I'm professor of Health Information Sciences at the University of Texas Health Science Center of Houston, and I'll be your host for today's program. Before we introduce today's program, I want to ask you a question, one that we'll answer before the end of the program, and that is, how much does a solar panel cost? A solar panel like you might use to power lights in your home, how much would that cost? We'll get to the answer before the end of today's program. Now, on September 13, 2008, Hurricane Ike struck Houston. Prior to that, approximately 3,000 people with disabilities, some with very serious health conditions, were evacuated from the Gulf Coast. People with disabilities were sent to San Antonio, Austin, Temple, Texas, and some to College Station. Those people were able to be safe from the storm because they had been evacuated. Other people with disabilities who lived in the wind zone outside where the hurricane was supposed to create waves high enough to hurt a person, those people were instructed to shelter in place, and they were not evacuated. Today we have a videotaped interview with one of the people from Houston, a person with a disability who sheltered in place during the storm. We want to listen to her story now.
What did you do to prepare for the storm, and how did that work?
I did everything. I did everything they said I should do. I followed the instructions. For my zip code, it said shelter in place. So I sheltered in place. I had a generator, a very, very high power generator. A couple days before the storm hit, I went out and I got all the high capacity electrical cords. I got water, I got food, I got batteries coming out the wazoo. I was ready. I was ready. And how did it work? It worked for about one day. There was all this stuff I didn't know. I mean, nobody told me the generators only work for like 10 hours at the best. And then you have to go buy more gas. Well, there wasn't any gas. No, I never expected that. I never expected that. And even though I knew that there wouldn't be water, somehow when the announcement came across that the water was contaminated, that just freaked me out. It just freaked me out. I mean, we were okay, but man, after one day of living off a generator, I said, this is for the birds. I just can't do it. And also, I didn't realize generators stink. They make the most fumes you can imagine. And even though we put it away from the house, there was still so much wind the next day that it was blowing all the fumes back into the house. And of course we had to have all the windows open. And I said, this is just crazy. I can't do this. I was starting to get really congested and I thought, I just can't. So we ended up evacuating. But after the storm, afterwards, it was just as much the mental trauma as the physical being shaken up by all of this that made us think twice about sticking around without electricity. When you're a person who depends so much on electricity like I am, it's really, really hard in the aftermath. Getting through the storm is one thing, but it's the aftermath that I really had no clue about. And there wasn't anything in the media, there wasn't really any warning about, be ready that you're not going to be able to have any gasoline. You're not going to be able to have access to the normal things that you would expect. I really didn't understand that was part of a hurricane.
And what is your status now, and what help do you need?
We're okay now. I'm still kind of getting over the hurricane brain syndrome, which is that feeling like, oh my goodness, what does it matter? What does anything matter if a big wind can come along and just totally wipe out life as you know it? Kind of makes it hard to get your ambition back up and your passion for doing stuff back up. So I'm still dealing with that, but we're fine. We're fine, other than financially. I mean, it was very, very expensive. There were no hotels in Austin. We evacuated to Austin, and a friend was able to get us the last remaining hotel room in all of Austin. But it was like one of these luxury kind of suites, and it was really expensive. We had a great time. It was very comfortable, but oh man, I'm so broke. So I don't know if there's going to be any reimbursement for that. I don't know if FEMA's going to pay for it. I didn't have any choice. I had to leave. I really, literally couldn't breathe. So I had to leave, and I had to take 2 attendants with me, and I had to pay them. Whereas normally I would just pay 1 at a time. I had to take 2 with me, so I had to pay. That fee was double for 6 days. We were gone for 6 days until the electricity came back on in our house. And then we returned, and everything was fine. But one other thing, I didn't expect is that the hurricane stirred up a whole lot of pollens and mold and all of that. So even though we stayed away for the first 6 days after it, when we came back, it was still, the air was pretty heavy with all of these natural pollutants. And I got really congested again, from all the allergy stuff. So that was a little hard to deal with. But we're okay. We'll survive. We'll get over it. Luckily, we didn't have any physical damage, so we didn't have to deal with insurance or anything like that. I'm still trying to figure out FEMA. And I did get a whole lot of papers in the mail from them, and I've got to work my way through all of that and try to figure out exactly what I'm supposed to submit, and I don't know if they'll reimburse anything or not.
And what will you do differently next time?
Next time, as soon as we know there's going to be a direct hit, I'm out of here. I am not staying. The sheltering in place business is for people who don't have extraordinary needs. I mean, I know some other folks who use ventilators, and they stayed, and they managed it somehow. But I guess I'm just not that tough. I just really, really need electricity. I'm going to evacuate immediately. I'm not even going to try to shelter in place. I'm going to save some money up to pay for that expense so I don't get socked with it unexpectedly. If that's possible in this economic times, I don't know. What else would I do differently? I really want to get solar paneling. I really want to try to go to an alternative source of electricity. I know it's very expensive, but if there's any way I can afford it, I really want to go solar. Houston is perfect for solar. And my house is perfect for solar. I've got lots of roof space. I don't have many trees that give too much shade, so it's great. I could be self-sustaining in that regard, and that would really help me a lot for my own security and for my own comfort.
That was Dr. Peg Nosek, and we're pleased that Peg could join us to be here in the studio with us today. Peg, welcome to Focus on Abilities.
Thanks for having me, Lex.
Peg, do you still feel like solar panels are the solution to weathering the storm?
Solar panels are a solution to a lot of things, but I'm not quite sure that they're the best for weathering a storm.
Now, you had a very emotional reaction when we asked you about Hurricane Ike and what you did to prepare for the storm. Do you still feel like you had done everything you could to be ready for it?
I really did. I mean, I made a lot of mistakes, and I learned a lot of lessons, but I did everything that they told you to do.
What would you do now that you didn't do the last time?
Get out of Houston.
That seems to be a very clear conclusion. And Peg, you've said that the generator made a lot of noise and a lot of odor. It was difficult to keep it running, and there were things that you didn't expect. After thinking back, and it's been several months now since the interview was taped and since the storm hit, do you still believe your calculation is right, that the generator probably wasn't the best solution for you as an individual?
No, it really wasn't. And I was naive. I didn't know. It was the first time I'd ever really used the generator. I never even turned the thing on, except to test it before that. But I never had any idea how badly it smelled.
But what about gasoline? I mean, did you have plenty of gasoline to keep it running and permanently?
No, and that's another thing I was naive about. I didn't know that when the power goes out to the whole city, the gas pumps don't work. I had no way to refill the generator.
Now, Peg, for the benefit of our audience, your life actually depends on power.
Yeah.
You have used, for how many years, a breathing machine?
8 years now.
And unless the power's going, when the power
It's
stops, the
scary.
machine stops. When
Yes.
the machine stops, so do you, right?
Well, I can breathe on my own for a little while, but a couple hours, but without getting really tired. But I really want to have that machine there, because if I start getting really congested, I can't breathe at all. And I'm just so highly dependent on these machines.
So you had a generator installed in your home just in case the power went out for an extended period of time, and you actually thought that would be sufficient to tide you over after a hurricane or another disaster where the power would predictably be off for a while.
Yes, I thought it would be enough, but it wasn't.
Furthermore, you had said you got water, you stockpiled some food and so on.
Oh, yeah.
How many days were you ready to stay in place with your food and water?
Probably about a week.
And how long was your power off?
Oh, the power was off for six days.
So you would have been, had you stayed, right at the end of your provisions. And other people with disabilities in Houston actually had power that was off for more than 2 weeks during the storm. People who had very much the same circumstances as you. Now, do you think at this point, Peg, the solution is to take all people with disabilities when there's a disaster and move them out of harm's way and out of the edge of harm's way?
Definitely out of harm's way. And let's redefine that edge. You know, what's possible for us, what's possible to survive for most people is not what's possible for us. You know, I lived in an area that was pretty far from the surge, but really I needed to get out. I shouldn't have stayed. I mean, I tend to be kind of wild. I like adventures, but this was a little bit too much.
So this was really more adventure than you might have hoped for.
Yeah, it really was. After I look back at it, you know, I think of all the possibilities with trees falling on the house and what had happened if something had knocked out my helpers. I mean, I would have been completely helpless.
You depend on, as you said, on tape with two assistants.
Yes.
And you need to provide for those assistants.
Yes. Yeah, I should have thought of their well-being more than my own.
Peg, you actually did evacuate. I mean, you didn't evacuate before the disaster, but you evacuated in the midst of the disaster. Was that a difficult decision to make at the time?
It was easy. It was easy because that smell was really getting to me. And I decided this is for the birds, you know, trying to live without electricity.
But to some extent, you had unusual circumstances because you had the means to evacuate even then. You had your own vehicle, you had it gassed up, and you knew where you would go.
Yes.
Other people in the same circumstances may not have been able to leave.
No. I mean, I was very fortunate to have those resources, and I found a cell phone that worked. You know, that was another thing, is when it really comes down to the real bottom line of the disaster, you really have to be as self-sufficient as you possibly can, because really the shelters couldn't help. There wasn't anybody except neighbors and friends and my attendants that I hired, who were the ones that I was relying on. So you really do have to just pull together all your possible resources and do what you have to do.
Peg, you said the shelters couldn't help. We want to go back and talk more about what people who may not be able to leave have to do and how they can survive. And we also want to talk about how we can change policy, perhaps, to ensure that survivability for more people and to ensure that more people can weather the storm safely without having to take risks by evacuating. We'll do that. I want to thank all of you for being with us today on Focus on Abilities. We'll be right back for more with Dr. Peg Nosek right after this break. Please stay tuned.
In 1990, in Severn, Maryland, the daughter of a clergyman was discovered by a music industry insider while pumping gas at a service station. The odds of her getting signed and spending 11 weeks at #1 on the U.S. singles charts? 1 in 19 million. The odds of this former church choir singer going on to sell 40 million records? 1 in 15 million. The odds of the same woman winning 6 Grammy Awards and starring in 2 Broadway plays? 1 in 75 million. The odds of this musician and performer having a child diagnosed with autism? 1 in 150. I'm Toni Braxton, and I encourage you to learn the signs of autism at autismspeaks.org. Early diagnosis can make a lifetime of difference.
Welcome back to Focus on Abilities. I'm Lex Frieden, your host, and we're here today with Dr. Peg Nosek, who made a valiant effort to weather in place following Hurricane Ike. Peg, you mentioned shelters and the difficulty that people might have relying on shelters. Did you yourself try to get into a shelter either before or during Hurricane Ike?
Well, when I realized that I wasn't going to be able to survive on the generator, because I was starting to have a lot of trouble breathing with the smells and the heat and all of that, I did call around. I called the Red Cross, I called some shelters, but the lines were busy. I was having trouble getting the phone to work. And what I found out when I did finally reach a real person to talk to them was that there was no guarantee that there would be electricity even at the shelter. And so I thought, well, that's not going to do me any good.
What did you think to call the city, the 311?
I did. I did.
And you got
I
the
couldn't
same
get
answer
through.
there. Oh,
I
you
couldn't get through. No, they
So
was busy the whole time.
Oh, that's fascinating. And some people didn't have phones, so it wouldn't have been useful for them to try and call either. With the phones in my house, for example, were offline for several days.
Yeah.
Peg, the shelters you feel are a real kind of iffy deal for people with
Yeah.
severe disabilities, at least.
Yeah, just because I have so many needs. You know, I need the electricity. That was the bottom line. And I needed the guarantee of electricity. And the only way to get that would be to go outside of the hurricane zone.
And you actually, the power was off quite in a large region, so you
Oh,
had to
yes.
go a long way. Where did you wind
Yes.
up going, to Austin?
We
I
went
think
to
you said?
Austin, yeah. You know what was interesting is, as we were driving out of Houston along the highways, it was really eerie because everything was so dark. And the only thing that was lit up were the car dealerships. Can you believe that? They had electricity. I should have just parked right there.
Yeah. Peg, the challenge for you then really came down to power. I mean, you had your attendants, you had your food and your water.
I did.
Your shelter stayed in place, and you were in the wind zone, live in a well-built home. So the challenge then was the power. And
Yes.
you have thought, as you said in the interview, about some alternative means of power, solar being one. Have you investigated to see how much it would cost to provide solar power to your home?
Expensive, extremely expensive. I mean, a little solar panel that's just enough to charge up one battery. And again, I go through like 2 batteries in a day. One battery would cost $1,000. Now, if I wanted to install solar panels on the whole roof of my house, that would be anywhere between $20,000 to $30,000, maybe even $40,000, depending on how much I put.
But would you need solar panels all over the roof of your house to power everything in your house? I guess you would need power for your wheelchair.
Yeah.
You'd need power for your ventilator.
Yeah.
And probably because of your respiratory situation, you need power for ventilation.
Well, the air conditioner to purify the air, too, because the air was so polluted right after the
And air conditioners
hurricane.
probably take a lot of power, so maybe you're not talking about 40,000, but maybe 20,000.
Well, a lot. A lot of money, more than I had, and certainly there was a time. But, you know, planning for the future, I'd love to have solar power for a lot of reasons. I mean, just to be ecologically sound. You know, our new administration is now really focusing alternative energies, and I want to be part of that. I want to contribute to that. So there are a lot of reasons to do it. But for the hurricane, that's not the primary reason.
And Peg, what about the alternative means of generation? Gas-powered, propane-powered generator or a natural gas-powered generator? Have you looked into those options?
Yes, I think that the natural gas might be the best option. From what I've heard, it is expensive. Not nearly as expensive as solar power, but it could be a box that's placed outside next to your air conditioning system that taps into your natural gas line, and it kicks in right when the power goes out, the electrical power goes out. And it's very reliable.
And I understand those systems, at least to power the minimum needs that you might have, would cost on the order of $8,000 to $10,000. So that's actually more reasonable than the solar, but it's still an extraordinary amount of money.
It is.
Particularly for somebody who might be living on a fixed income, particularly. Now, can you imagine at some point in the future having some kind of subsidy from FEMA that would provide you with a voucher that would enable you to more appropriately prepare to weather a disaster, hurricane or otherwise, by installing the appropriate kind of safety equipment in your home?
Oh, that would be so helpful. Not only the financial support, but also just the technical support. You know, I don't know that much about the mechanics of it. It'd be really great to have advice, some recommendations on where to go, who could put it in, how to put it in. I don't want to get ripped off by, if somebody's trying to make money off of it.
Right.
I just want a good system that's going to work. I'd love to have some technical assistance. So I think, yes, I think FEMA could really contribute to this by helping us financially and helping us technically get alternative systems in place. But also, I would love to see the city do a little bit more with the shelters also to make some locations that have electricity, publicize those, at least to the people who have extraordinary needs, like people in my situation.
Right. So you would have much preferred going to a local shelter
Yes.
that was hardened from the weather, that had
Yes.
reliable power, rather than evacuating to, as you described it, a luxury suite in Austin.
Yeah. I mean, that was fun. But it was very expensive. Yeah.
Not only expensive, but it took you away from your
Everything. Yeah.
support network, from your home, from your work, from everything.
I would much rather have been able to stay close to my home, yes.
So you were prepared to make some sacrifices in terms of comfort in order to stay close to home.
And by close, I mean like within an hour's drive. That would be really ideal.
Okay. It seems like that's a reasonable kind of expectation.
Yeah.
And with respect to the idea of having some kind of assistance to prepare individually, some people would say, well, that's a lot of money and we can't possibly do that. But when you stop to compare the cost that we spent evacuating people and keeping people in shelters miles and miles from their homes, those costs were extraordinary too. So if
Yes,
there's a way to
absolutely.
help people shelter in place and do so safely, maybe we seriously should consider that, you think?
And I wish that there could be a system of like pods or centers that people knew. They could go and store their insulin. They could go and store their medications. If they had the battery and they were okay with just battery power, where they could go and charge up their battery. If we could have neighborhood centers or some places scattered around the city, that would be enormously helpful. It would reduce the traffic of people trying to go to one shelter or just even a couple shelters. Somehow to make it manageable to support people in their independence. That's the trick. When we're away from our homes, we're totally dependent on other people, and it's not necessary. That cost and all of that trouble is not necessary. Give us some place that can help us reinforce our existing systems. And then we can come back home and do, what we would normally do.
Well, you make a good point about independence. In Hurricane Katrina, thousands of people were evacuated after the storm and some before. Many people with disabilities were evacuated out of the New Orleans area, many outside the Louisiana area, and because they did not have the systems that were in place in their own home, because they didn't have the networks of support from their family and friends that they had in home, many of those people were placed, they said temporarily, in institutions, in nursing homes.
Oh, it's
and
horrible.
we know that many of those people never left. They're still there, years
It gives
after.
me chills to think of that.
Well,
years?
it's a possibility.
They're still,
They're still there.
it's just inexcusable. These are people who have worked really, really hard to set their lives up so that they can be independent and rely on others to the minimum extent possible. And look what's happened. That is totally unnecessary.
Peg, the other thing that I think people don't really realize is that in Houston, for example, there are a lot of people who are dependent on power. And I'm not just talking about people who expect to wake up in the morning, turn the television on, and watch the news. I'm talking about people whose lives, very lives, really depend on machines like you use to breathe and to survive. We're talking about people who use ventilators, people who may have had some kind of disability or illness that causes them to need ventilators to breathe. We're talking about people who are on chemotherapy, who need power to run the pumps to run the therapy.
Right.
We're talking about people who need dialysis.
Home dialysis,
Many
right.
people who need dialysis. We are
Right.
talking about people who use power wheelchairs to enable them to get from their bed to the toilet and from their bed to something to eat. we're talking about literally in this city, probably 30 to 40,000 people.
Yes.
And we're not prepared to meet the needs of those people in case the power goes down, regardless of the circumstances. It could be a hurricane, but it could be another kind of circumstance that causes the power grid to drop. And those people have an interest, a self-interest, and I think like you, most people have done everything they can to protect and provide for themselves, but perhaps there's more we need to do, and I think you've given us a couple of good ideas with the shelters that might be available to people that could provide power, and also with some kinds of assistance to people to help them prepare better using better technology.
And this also speaks to the need to register with 211 or 311 about what needs you have for an emergency. Now I know you went to your local fire station and you told them, hey, I'm here, you know, help me if you can. Why can't we all do that? Why can't there be a registration system so that the city and all the emergency relief folks know that we're here real? Maybe we need a minimum of assistance, but if they can just provide that minimum of assistance, access to a live electrical plug for 1 hour a day, maybe that's all we need.
We had people in Houston who, following the storm, in order to keep the power running on their generators, actually drove their power wheelchairs with their batteries, their extra batteries in their lap, down the street to a McDonald's that, like the auto dealer, happened to have power, charged their batteries, and I suppose had a few Big Macs, and drove home for another day. They were charged up, and they came back again the next day.
Yeah.
Now, that happened over and over again. Personally, I had to go to a hospital where I knew they had power in order to charge my wheelchair and turn my computer on and so on, and then return home. Fortunately, we had metro and transportation was accessible and available to people who needed to do that. But another disaster could prevent transportation from operating normally. And there are many considerations one needs to make. So I guess the biggest question that a person with a very severe disability like yourself might have to ask themselves is whether to go or whether to stay.
Right, right. And I think for me, the answer is go for the critical time. Be gone for a week. And then come back and just tough it out. I mean, by that time, some systems will be returning, but that's my plan for the future.
So regardless of what the public authorities say about evacuating or not, you consider yourself to be in a separate class simply because you have these extraordinary needs.
Yeah, and I wish that the announcements that went out where they were telling people shelter in place unless, I wish they'd had that clause in there, unless you have an extremely high need for electricity, and then think seriously what your alternatives are.
It's a very good point. So, Peg, there's a number of things that we can do in the future. You're prepared. You're prepared, in fact, if there's a hurricane in the Gulf, to take action and evacuate yourself,
Yes.
Regardless of the circumstances early.
Yes.
You're also preparing to provide some kinds of backup power to your home if it's available and affordable,
Yes.
which is more reliable than you have. You would recommend having public access to shelters where there is power and safety
Yes.
for a temporary period. And you would recommend that everyone register with 211 so that
Yes.
public authorities know where you are when you need assistance after a
Right.
disaster.
And also an appeal to neighbors. My neighbors were absolutely wonderful. They came and checked on me. I mean, that's really so heartening, and that's really the basis of our support. So I just want to thank everybody who did help me and encourage other neighbors to just check in on other friends who might need some extra help.
Thanks, Peg. I want to thank you, Peg Nosek, for being our guest on Focus on Abilities today. I want to thank all of you for watching today. We've had a great program about preparing for disaster, and particularly if you have a severe impairment or know someone who does, register with 211, prepare to shelter in place, and prepare to evacuate if necessary. I'm Lex Frieden, your host. Please join us next time for more Focus on Abilities.